The poem we're going to look at today is called In Light and Darkness. It's another one of the early poems by Chris Wallace-Crabbe. Wallace-Crabbe was in his 30s when he wrote this poem. And again, like some of the other poems, Shadows and The Swing, it plays on that idea of light and dark and uses them metaphorically as a way to contemplate life in a more broad sense. So the poem begins, we can see it's structured with quite a lot of variation. It uses end stopping quite a bit. It's got sections where it's tabulated in to signify different elements of the same verse. So structurally, there's a lot to look at here, and it's really important when you're looking at the poem to also keep in mind why he's chosen to end some of his lines the way he has, why he's chosen to start some of his lines the way he has, and really focusing in on that language. And we'll pick up on a little bit of that today, but also it's something to look at also when you are closely analysing it and starting to pull it apart on your own. He begins, to the noonday eye, light seems an ethical agent, straight from the shoulder, predictable, terribly quick, though. It climbs in a curve to space's unlikely limit, thus posing a problem for mathematicians and God, whatever he turns out to be and wherever he's dwelling. So we have this first sentence that comes up. He's focusing in on this idea of noonday, in full light, in the middle of the day. One can, understand everything. That's what he's alluding to here in this first little section of the poem. This really plays on that idea of how things seem so clear in the full day or in the full light of day, and yet can seem so obscure or even frightening to children at night time. Right? He uses this really interesting idiom, straight from the shoulder. Everything is very straightforward, it's direct. And outlines that's how things seem in the full light of the day, right? He talks about here, thus posing a problem for mathematicians and God, whatever he turns out to be and wherever he's dwelling. He's saying that, for the logical thinkers, for the religious thinkers, regardless, we've got this... the light ties everyone together. It's the same for everyone. And we get this very sort of picturesque, beautiful description that comes in the next phrase. Rich is the clotting of gold in the late afternoon, or turning to twilight, one last blaze of watery colour, where man can project his false dreams in figures of light, pretending that all his environment loyally loves him, seas of ice and burning plains. So you get this very interesting contrast, rich, gold, blaze of watery colour. So beautiful imagery. Clashing with this idea of false dreams. pretending, seas of ice and burning plains. The light allows that false sense of hope almost. Or a sense of self. And then we see this gap, this moment of silence in the poem before he comes in with this segment right towards the end of the very same line, in essence. Too easy, bending nature for us, but light is defiant, coming by night from dead stars with terrible speed. So is our planet rebuked, and we meet in mirrors, desperate masks, eyes of imprisoned strangers, and lips that open to say, we are only mirages, while the lawns outside are green and the roses real. So if we think about some of the other poems in this collection, he keeps coming back to this idea of, what is our true self? Are we really what we claim to be? Are we really what people see us to be? This idea of, so is our planet rebuked, and we meet in mirrors, desperate masks, eyes of imprisoned strangers. This idea of the alternate version of ourselves, almost. That comes in reflections, shadows, darkness, quite contemplative about what it is that he's looking at. Who are we? And he sort of interrogates this in the next line with this question: you dub the sun a realist, and then it will plague you, wading with stork legs into the green water, lending the oak bole moss its leopard shadows, or streaking paddocks darkly with sunset sheep 50 feet long. Here, he challenges this idea that everything that we see in the light is real by providing us with a range of images of when light betrays our sense of self or betrays reality. The optical illusion of how long objects appear when looking through water, or this last one here, the idea of a sunset creating a really elongated shadow, and the fact that it then betrays the actual size of the object itself. So all of these things are captured here in this first part when he's sort of challenging this idea of the sun being a realist. He says, nothing is quite so rococo as dawnlight caught on a fish-scale formation of cirrus, nor quite so romantic as one gilded westering biplane. We just don't live in a hard intellectual glare. So there's a few different images that he's sort of playing on here. Rococo is an artistic form. It's a very ornamental style. And he uses this to describe, the dawnlight catching on the fish-scale formations of cirrus. So cirrus are those wisping clouds that we sometimes see in the sky. Nor quite so romantic as one gilded westering biplane. We just don't live in a hard intellectual glare. What he's trying to say is the world isn't as, crisp and clean as that. We also live in shadow. And so this idea of we also live in shadow. This idea of the world being more complex than that, that you can't necessarily believe everything that you see, but also that you have to contemplate the world in both light and dark, as the poem suggests, the title of it, is what he's trying to get at here, that there's deception in everything that we see, and that if we really want to understand the world, we need to look at it with both of these ideas in mind. As he continues on, no one, of course, endures darkness or daylight entirely. And that's kind of what he's trying to get at in the broad scheme of things. We all experience both of those things. Cyclic changes betray our terrestrial journey, and what looked like trees at dawn turn out to be crosses, suddenly black as the florid sun goes down, and maybe at midnight resemble gallows or statues as we slip past, childlike, alone. So again, he's making a broader commentary about who we are as people. That's, whether blessed or cursed, good or evil. We live in a world with both. He again has a bit of a moment of pause here. A contemplative moment again before he moves on to the next idea. And then we actually do get another break in the line. No wonder sly poets admiringly use, but will not warm to the subtle machines that teach our world to spin. These are too steady for reverence. Gods must be changeable, since worship is saved for what we cannot govern. Gods push up grass, channel the dense sap through pine boughs, and amass the pewter cloud banks of summer storm. What we see structurally here is really dense language. As he's starting to really try to come to grips with the idea and the complexity of what he's suggesting, so too does the language in the poem itself. It's no longer simple or fleeting sentences. It's very, very complex, very, very dense. And it conveys the complexity of the idea that he's trying to capture. He also really briefly, and this is something that does pop up in a few of his poems, questions religion and makes this remark that, gods must be changeable. We can't look at everything in black and white or light and dark. And it's an interesting idea that religion is mixed up in his contemplations about the world and what's going on and how we view ourselves within it. But he does so, fleetingly in this before he moves on. So he doesn't sit there and labour the point. He appears then in this next section in a memory almost, so childlike. Once I awoke, a child in a chill mountain morning, to see the small town, undreamed transfiguration, mantled in white, its slate and stone and timber bright with that foreign cloak of innocence. This idea of snow or white, reflecting that idea of innocence. Just plays on that really common idea of the colour white. But he has this recollection of the town covered in snow, and I walked into old world beauty, the gilt sun rising, fell in a garden where time itself was congealing as we shaped wonderful igloos under the stringy barks. So it's quite a rare thing to see snow in most parts of Australia, and he keeps coming back to this idea of it being a bit foreign, and comparing how it sits, these wonderful igloos under stringy barks. It's quite a novel image that he's creating in this little section of the poem. But he also then alludes to it being very short-lived. But noon came on, something was lost in the brown receding slush there, which has not returned, something other than childhood, a notion rather of clear crystalline standards, freezing life to one shape like a photograph. So this dream that he sort of talks about at the start of this section becomes a reality. It's shattered here. And we go again from what is quite literal imagery back into this more contemplative idea that something else was lost there, which has not returned, something other than childhood, a notion, freezing life to one shape like a photograph. So the language becomes darker, and it comes back to this idea of reality. And so the poem continues. Yet this is the point. So again, a very abrupt use, including the use of the colon. So stopping the flow of the poem to try and emphasize this last section that he moves into. A photograph leaves out living for eaten crops, old blazes, baptismal lace, or some late Victorian smile to turn stiff and waxy. All arabesques, but never the heart of the thing, which is neither good nor bad, but one maze of motion through which we dance into and out of the darkness to tireless music, motes in the curled winds breathing, and more than motes faced with the corners of choice. So quite this elongated section that we've got here where he uses this idea of the photograph and unpacks how anything that is just two-dimensional like that is not real. It's not the real person. Coming back to his idea of light and dark, photographs in and of themselves are scientifically a combination of light and dark. But they're two-dimensional. And they are fleeting, and that's what he's capturing in this little section. He carries with it this very old-fashioned, if you like, image. Eaten crops, so that's short hairdos from the 1920s. The old blazers, the baptismal lace around the neck, late Victorian smiles turned stiff and waxy. He says these are all arabesques, they're ornaments, they're decoration, but they're never the heart of the thing, which for him is reality itself. They aren't the true nature of someone. In spite of the fact that this is a poem that was written quite a while ago, 50 plus years ago. It's interesting that this idea of imagery is something which is very relatable now in the modern age of presenting the best self to the world, and the way that people manipulate images of themselves to convey a particular meaning. This thing that he's capturing here in reference to this last section of the poem, quite pertinent today and in today's age. He continues with that, which is neither good nor bad, but one maze of motion through which we dance, into and out of the darkness, to tireless music, motes in the curled wind, in the curled wind's breathing, and more than motes, faced with the corners of choice. So if we think of motes, so there's little dust particles floating in the air. Quite often they're out of control. They just float and exist and move with the flow of things. And that's what he's saying, this maze of motion, motes that are curled in wind's breathing, tireless music, this idea that we all move through light, through dark, all of us have a little bit of both. We can never be perfect beings. We have moments of light and moments of darkness in us all, and he's capturing that. He's trying to show that that's the true nature of humanity. And so he concludes, and so at night, below all the brilliant clusters of lamps in the sky, the living, dead, and dying, poised in their dance, I cling to the crust here stolidly and pray for a perfect day. So clinging to the crust, trying to ground himself in reality. As much as he can. And he prays for the perfect day. It's a very common element in Wallace-Crabbe's writing that he has this hopeful tone for humanity. It very often pops up in the poems that we see in this collection. Out in the cold of hoarfrost and starlight, we fear for tomorrow's choosing and cherish dreams made in meticulous patterns. But come tomorrow, we will neither be Christ nor Gandhi, but will breathe this polluted air and rejoice with the birds. So this is the conclusion that he's coming to, that we've sort of been working our way up to. This remark here, we will neither be Christ nor Gandhi. We will neither be the saviour nor the wise, selfless person in these two images of Christ and Gandhi. Is essentially alluding to the fact that, as each day comes, in spite of all that we dream and hope for, we cannot reach this ideal or perfection. That's not who humans necessarily are. And then here's this very interesting imagery to conclude this section of the poem, this verse. But we'll breathe this polluted air and rejoice with the birds. The polluted air, this darkness that's alluded to in the title, the fact that the world is filled with, you could think of literal pollution, but also the pollution of the way people behave and speak. And yet rejoice with the birds, right? There's an irony in this concluding sentence, that in spite of it all, we will live with both the light and the darkness, because what choice do we have, really? all of us here in this ordinary world, is what he's trying to essentially tell us. And again, just as before, he concludes with a very hope-filled tone. Interjects again, all that I ask is that myriad lights, ever changing, continue to play on this great rind of ranges and valleys, flooding the vision of dreaming dwellers in cities. So it comes back to this idea of the light. It links in with that idea of hope. And then he concludes with this couplet, quite the traditional way of ending quite lengthy poems. Who walk out in summer pursuing something to praise, we will neither be simple nor clear to the end of our days. So he comes to that conclusion. It's simultaneously questioning, but also a bit rhetorical. We don't see a question mark at the end here. He's coming to that conclusion that we will neither be simple nor clear for the entirety of our lives. We will live in both light and dark. All right? So life is neither of these things. Coming back to the title, filled with both light and dark. So quite the contemplative poem. It's one of the longer ones that we're going to be looking at. And he does spend quite a considerable amount of time moving back and forth between different ideas relating to what it means to be human, what it means to be alive, and coming to that realization that we can never really achieve perfection. For the rare few, it may be there, but really, for most of us, we need to be living constantly in this flow between light and dark. So this was the poem by Chris Wallace-Crabbe, In Light and Darkness.